Hello and welcome to the Cultured Bumpkin. This is chapter 29 of Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. And the plan tonight is to finish the book. All right, we got 3 chapters left. 29. It's kind of a long one. 30 is not that long, and 31 is pretty short. So I don't think it'll take that long. So I think, tonight's the night. If you're new here, this is live recording. What I do is I take the sound files, I pull the sound, edit it into an audiobook, and then re-upload it onto the channel. And then if you want to hear ad-free, you can check out my Patreon. $3 a month. It's like a little Culture Bumpkin Netflix. You can listen to all my stuff without the ads and support the show. So, but either way, this will be edited and put on YouTube very soon, the good Lord willing. So, without any further ado, let's get started. Okay. Well, dang it, I clicked off of there. I'm sorry. Let me pull it back up. We're waiting. Okay. All right. Northanger. Okay. Here we go. 29. Chapter 29. Chapter 29. Catherine was too wretched to be fearful. The journey in itself had no terrors for her, and she began it without either dreading its length or feeling its solitariness. Leaning back in one corner of the carriage in a violent burst of tears, she was conveyed some miles beyond the walls of the Abbey. Before she raised her head, and the highest point of ground within the park was almost closed from her view before she was capable of turning her eyes toward it. Unfortunately, the road she now traveled was the same which only 10 days ago she had so happily passed along in going to and from Woodston, and for 14 miles every bitter feeling was rendered more severe by the review of objects on which she had first looked under impressions very different. Every mile, as it brought her nearer Woodston, added to her sufferings, and when within the distance of 5, she passed the turning which led to it, and thought of Henry, so near, yet so unconscious, her grief and agitation were excessive. The day which she had spent at that place had been one of the happiest of her life. It was on that day. Dang it. Okay, there we go, sorry. Where is it? It was on that day that the general had made use of such expressions with regard to Henry and herself, had so spoken and so looked as to give her the most positive conviction of his actually wishing their marriage. Yes, only 10 days ago had he elated her by his pointed regard, and he even confused her by his too significant reference. And now, what had she done? Or what had she omitted to do to merit such a change? The only offense against him of which she could accuse herself had been such as was scarcely possible to reach his knowledge. Henry and her own heart only were privy to the shocking suspicions which she had so idly entertained, and equally safe did she believe her secret with each. Designedly, at least, Henry could not have betrayed her. If indeed by any strange mischance his father should have gained intelligence of what she had dared to think and look for, of her causeless fancies and injurious examinations, she could not wonder at any degree of his indignation. If aware of her having viewed him as a murderer, she could not wonder at his even turning her from his house. But a justification so full of torture to herself, she trusted, would not be in his power. Anxious as were all her conjectures on this point, it was not, however, the one on which she dwelt most. There was a thought yet nearer, a more prevailing, more impetuous concern. How Henry would think and feel and look when he returned on the morrow to Northanger and heard of her being gone was a question of force and interest to rise over every other, to be never ceasing, alternately irritating and soothing. It sometimes suggested the dread of his calm acquiescence, and at others was answered by the sweetest confidence in his regret and resentment. To the general, of course, he would not dare to speak, but to Eleanor, what might he not say to Eleanor about her? In this unceasing recurrence of doubts and inquiries on any one particle of which her mind was incapable of more than momentary on any one article of which her mind was incapable of more than momentary repose, the hours passed away, and her journey advanced much faster than she looked for. The pressing anxieties of thought, which prevented her from noticing anything before her when once beyond the neighborhood of Woodston, saved her at the same time from watching her progress, and though no object on the road could engage a moment's attention, she found no stage of it tedious. From this she was preserved, too, by another cause, by feeling no eagerness for her journey's conclusion, for to return in such a manner to Fullerton was almost to destroy the pleasure of a meeting with those whom she loved best, even after an absence such as hers, an 11 weeks' absence. What had she to say that would not humble herself and pain her family, that would not increase her own grief by the confession of it, extend an useless resentment, and perhaps involve the innocent with the guilty in undistinguishing ill will? She could never do justice to Henry and Eleanor's merit. She felt it too strongly for expression, and should a dislike be taken against them, should they be thought of unfavorably on their father's account, it would cut her to the heart. I'm going to take a little somebody out there? My daughter made Pop-Tarts. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Look at that. Look at that Pop-Tart. That is a good Pop-Tart. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Wetting the old whistle. Got a little coffee. Thank you, Abigail. Oh. Oh, thank you very much. And one of my very own mugs that I made. Good night. I sure love you. I'm going to take me a little quick bite of this. Let's see how good it is. Oh, amazing. Amazing. Okay. Sorry. A good friend of mine that's a sound designer, one of his axioms is never make someone endure hearing you eat. So I'm very sorry. But I'm going to take this one little bite and then we'll be good. Okay, sorry about the delay. Getting ready. Okay. Where was I? Okay. Where were we? With all these feelings, she rather dreaded than sought for the first view of that well-known spire which would announce her within 20 miles of home. Salisbury she had known to be her point on leaving Northanger, but after the first stage she had been indebted to the postmasters for the names of the places which were then to conduct her to it. So great had been her ignorance of her route. She met with nothing, however, to distress or frighten her. Her youth, civil manners, and liberal pay procured her all the attention that a traveler like herself could require, and stopping only to change horses, she traveled on for about 11 hours without accident or alarm, and between 6 and 7 o'clock in the evening found herself entering Fullerton. A heroine returning at the close of her career to her native village in all the triumph of recovered reputation, in all the dignity of a countess, with a long train of noble relations in their several phaetons, and 3 waiting maids in a travelling chaise and 4 behind her, is an event on which the pen of the contriver may well delight to dwell. It gives credit to every conclusion, and the author must share in the glory she so liberally bestows. But my affair is widely different. I bring back my heroine to her home in solitude and disgrace, and no sweet elation of spirits can lead me into minuteness. A heroine in a hack post-chaise is such a blow upon sentiment as no attempt at grandeur or pathos can withstand. Swiftly, therefore, shall her post-boy drive through the village amid the gaze of Sunday groups, and speedy shall be her descent from it. But whatever might be the distress of Catherine's mind, as she thus advanced towards the parsonage, and whatever the humiliation of her biographer in relating it, she was preparing enjoyment of no everyday nature for those to whom she went. First, in the appearance of her carriage, and secondly, in herself. The chaise of a traveller being a rare sight in Fullerton, the whole family were immediately at the window, and to have it stop at the sweep gate was a pleasure to brighten every eye and occupy every fancy. A pleasure quite unlooked for by all but the 2 youngest children, a boy and girl of 6 and 4 years old, who expected a brother or sister in every carriage. Happy the glance that first distinguished Catherine. Happy the voice that proclaimed the discovery. But whether such happiness were the lawful property of George or Harriet could never be exactly understood. Her father, mother, Sarah, George, and Harriet, all assembled at the door to welcome her with affectionate eagerness, was a sight to awaken the best feelings of Catherine's heart. And in the embrace of each, as she stepped from the carriage, she found herself soothed beyond anything that she had believed possible. So surrounded, so caressed, she was even happy. In the joyfulness of family love, everything, for a short time, was subdued, and the pleasure of seeing her, leaving them at first little leisure for calm curiosity, they were all seated round the tea-table, which Mrs. Morland had hurried for the comfort of the poor traveller, whose pale and jaded looks soon caught her notice, before any inquiry so direct as to demand a positive answer was addressed to her. Reluctantly, and with much hesitation, did she then begin what might perhaps at the end of half an hour be termed by the courtesy of her hearers an explanation. But scarcely within that time could they at all discover the cause or collect the particulars of her sudden return. They were far from being an irritable far from any quickness in matching, far from any quickness in catching, or bitterness in resenting affronts. But here, when the whole was unfolded, was an insult not to be overlooked, nor for the first half hour to be easily pardoned. Without suffering any romantic alarm in the consideration of their daughter's long and lonely journey, Mr. and Mrs. Morland could not but feel that it might have been productive of much unpleasantness to her, that it was what they could never have voluntarily suffered, and that in forcing her on such a measure, General Tilney had acted neither honorably nor feelingly, neither as a gentleman nor as a parent. Why he had done it, what could have provoked him to such a breach of hospitality, and so suddenly turned all his partial regard for their daughter into actual ill will, was a matter which they were at least as far from driving as Catherine herself. But it did not oppress them by any means so long, and after a due course of useless conjecture, that it was a strange business, that he must be a very strange man, grew enough for all their indignation and wonder, though Sarah indeed still indulged in the sweets of incomprehensibility, exclaiming and conjecturing with youthful ardor. "My dear, you give yourself a great deal of needless trouble," said her mother at last. "Depend upon it, it's something not at all worth understanding." I can allow for his wishing Catherine away when he recollected this engagement. Oh, I can allow for his wishing Catherine away when he recollected this engagement, said Sarah. But why not do but why not do it civilly? I'm sorry for the young people, returned Mrs. Moreland. They must have had a sad time of it. But as for anything else, it's no matter now. Catherine's safe at home, and our comfort does not depend upon General Tilney. Catherine sighed. Well, continued her philosophic mother, I am glad I did not know of your journey at the time. But now it's over, perhaps there's no great harm done. It's always good for young people to put on exerting themselves. It's always good for young people to be put upon It's always good for young people to be put upon exerting themselves. And you know, my dear Catherine, you always were a sad little shatterbrained creature. But now you must have been forced to have your wits about you, with so much changing of chases and so forth, and I hope it'll appear to you and I hope it will appear that you have not left anything behind you in any of the pockets. Getting on there, getting on. Let's see. Hope you're having a good night, whether you're live or catching the old replay. Excuse me. Hopefully, this is the last one of Northanger Abbey, the last session. All right. Where? Catherine hoped so too, and tried to feel an interest in her own amendment, but her spirits were quite worn down, and to be silent and alone becoming her own and to be silent and alone becoming soon her only wish, she readily agreed to her mother's next counsel of going early to bed. Her parents, seeing nothing in her ill looks and agitation but the natural consequence of mortified feelings and the unusual exertion and fatigue of such a journey, parted from her without any doubt of their being soon slept away. And though, when they all met the next morning, her recovery was not equal to their hopes, they were still perfectly unsuspicious of there being any deeper evil. They, excuse me, they never once thought of her heart, which, for the parents of a young lady of 17, just returned from her first excursion from home, was odd enough. As soon as breakfast was over, she sat down to fulfill her promise to Miss Tilney, whose trust in the effect of time and distance on her friend's disposition was already justified. For already did Catherine reproach herself with having parted from Eleanor coldly, with having never enough valued her merits or kindness, and never enough commiserated her for what she had been yesterday left to endure. The strength of these feelings, however, was far from assisting her pen, and never had it been harder for her to write than in addressing Eleanor Tilney. To, to compose a letter which might at once do justice to her sentiments and her situation, convey gratitude without servile regret, be guarded without coldness, and honest without resentment, a letter which Eleanor might not be pained by the perusal of, and above all, which she might not blush herself, if Henry should chance to see, was an undertaking to frighten away all her powers of performance, and after long thought and much perplexity, to be very brief was all that she could to be very brief was all that she could determine on any with confidence. To be very brief was all that she could determine on with any confidence of safety. The money, therefore, which Eleanor had advanced was enclosed with little more than grateful thanks, and the 1,000 good wishes of a most affectionate heart. "This has been a strange acquaintance," observed Mrs. Moreland as the letter was finished. "Soon made and soon ended. I'm sorry it happened so, for Mrs. Allen thought them very pretty kind of young people, and you were sadly out of luck, too, in your Isabella. Ah, poor James. Well, we must learn and live, and the next new friends you make I hope will be better worth keeping." Catherine colored as she warmly answered, "No friend can be better worth keeping than Eleanor. If so, my dear, I dare say you will meet again some time or other. Don't be uneasy. It's 10 to 1 but that you're thrown together again in the course of a few years, and then what a pleasure it'll be." Mrs. Moreland was not happy in her attempted consolation. The hope of meeting again in the course of a few years could only put into Catherine's head what might happen within that time to make a to make a meeting dreadful to her. She could never forget Henry Tilney or think of him with less tenderness than she did at that moment. But he might forget her, and in that case, to meet, her eyes filled with tears as she pictured her acquaintance so renewed, and her mother, perceiving her comfortable suggestions to have no good effect, proposed as another expedient for restoring her spirits that they should call on Mrs. Allen. The two houses were only a quarter of a mile apart, and as they walked, Mrs. Moreland quickly dispatched all that she felt on the score of James's disappointment. "We're sorry for him," said she, "but otherwise there's no harm done in the match going off, for it could not be a desirable thing to have him engaged to a girl whom we had not the smallest acquaintance with, and who was so entirely without fortune. And now, after such behavior, we cannot think at all well of her. Just at present it comes hard to poor James, but that'll not last forever, and I dare say he'll be a discreeter man all his life for the foolishness of his first choice." This was such a summary view of the affair as Catherine could listen to. Another sentence might have endangered her complacence and made her reply less rational, for soon were all her thinking powers swallowed up in the reflection of her own change of feelings and the spirits since last she had trodden that well-known road. It was not 3 months ago since, wild with joyful expectation, she had been there. She had there run backwards and forwards some 10 times a day with a light heart, gay and independent, looking forward to pleasures untasted and unalloyed, and free from the apprehension of evil as from the knowledge of it. 3 months had seen her all this, and now, how altered a being did she return! She was received by the Allens with all the kindness which her unlooked-for appearance, acting on a steady affection, would naturally call forth, and great was their surprise and warm their displeasure on hearing how she had been treated, though Mrs. Moreland's account of it was no inflated representation, no studied appeal to their passions. "Catherine took us quite by surprise yesterday evening," said she. "She traveled all the way post by herself, and knew nothing of coming till Saturday night, for General Tilney, from some odd fancy or other, all of a sudden grew tired of having her there, and almost turned her out of the house. Very unfriendly, certainly, and he must be a very odd man, but we're glad to have her amongst us again, and it's a great comfort to find that she's not a poor helpless creature, but can shift very well for herself." Mr. Allen expressed himself on the occasion with the reasonable resentment of a sensible friend, and Mrs. Allen thought his expressions quite good enough to be immediately made use of again by herself. His wonder, his conjectures, and his explanations became in succession hers, with the addition of this single remark: "I really have not patience with the General," to fill up every accidental pause, and "I really have not patience with the General" was uttered twice after Mr. Allen left the room, without any relaxation of anger or any material digression of thought. A more considerable degree of wandering attended the third repetition, and after completing the and after completing the fourth, she immediately added, "Oh, think, my dear, of my having got that frightful great rent in my best Mechlin so charmingly mended before I left Bath that one can hardly see where it was. I must show you it some day or other. Bath is a nice place, Catherine, after all. I assure you I did not above half like coming away. Mrs. Thorpe's being there was such a great comfort to us, was it not? You know, you and I were quite forlorn at first." "Yes, but that did not last long," said Catherine, her eyes brightening at the recollection of what had first given spirit to her existence there. "Very true. We soon met with Mrs. Thorpe, and then we wanted for nothing. My dear, do you not see these silk gloves wear very well? Do you not think these silk gloves wear very well? I put 'em on new the first time of our going to the lower rooms, you know, and I have worn 'em a great deal since. Do you remember that evening?" "Do I? Oh, perfectly. It was very agreeable, was it not? Mr. Tilney drank tea with us, and I always thought him a great addition. He's so very agreeable. I have a notion you danced with him, but I'm not quite sure. I remember I had my favorite gown on." Catherine could not answer, and after a short trial of other subjects, Mrs. Allen again returned to, "I really have not patience with the General. Such an agreeable, worthy man as he seemed to be. I don't suppose, Mrs. Morland, you ever saw a better bred man in your life. His lodgings were taken the very day he left. His lodgings were taken the very day after he left them, Catherine. But no wonder, Milsom Street, you know." As they walked home again, Mrs. Morland endeavored to impress on her daughter's mind the happiness of having such steady well-wishers as Mr. and Mrs. Allen, and the very little consideration which the neglect or unkindness of slight acquaintance like the Tilneys ought to have with her, while she could preserve the good opinion and affection of her earliest friends. There was a great deal of good sense in all this, but there are some situations of the human mind in which good sense has very little power. In Catherine's feelings contradicted almost every other. In Catherine's feelings contradicted almost every position her mother advanced. It was upon the behavior of these very slight acquaintance that all her help. It was upon the behavior of these very slight acquaintances that all her present happiness depended. And while Mrs. Morland was successfully confirming her own opinions by the justness of her own representations, Catherine was silently reflecting that now Henry must have arrived at Northanger, now he must have heard of her departure, and now perhaps they were all letting off for Hereford. That was chapter 29, so we're about to start chapter 30. Chapter 30. Catherine's disposition was not naturally sedentary, nor had her habits ever been very industrious. But whatever might hitherto have been her defects of that sort, her mother could not but perceive them now to be greatly increased. She could neither sit still nor employ herself for 10 minutes together, walking round the garden and orchard again and again, as if nothing but notion was voluntary. And it seemed as if she could even walk up and it seemed as if she could even walk about the house rather than remain fixed for any time in the parlor. Her loss of spirits was yet her loss of spirits was yet her loss of spirits was a yet greater alteration. In her rambling and her idleness, she might only be a character of herself, but in her silence and sadness, she was the very reverse of all that she had been before. For 2 days, Mrs. Morland allowed it to pass without a hint. But when a third night's rest had neither restored her cheerfulness, improved her in useful activity, nor given her a greater inclination for needlework, she could no longer refrain from the gentle reproof. She could no longer refrain from the gentle reproof of, "My dear Catherine, I'm afraid you're growing quite a fine lady. I don't know when poor Richard's cravats would be done if he had no friend but you. Your head runs too much upon Bath, and there's a time for everything, a time for balls and plays, and a time for work. You've had a long run of amusement, and now you must try and be useful." Catherine took up her work directly, saying in a dejected voice that her head did not run upon Bath much. "Then you are fretting about General Tilney, and that's very simple of you. For 10 to 1, you never see him again. You should never fret about trifles." After a short silence, "I hope, my Catherine, you're not getting out of humor. You're not getting out. You're not getting out of humor with home because it's not so grand as Northanger. That would be turning your visit into an evil indeed. Wherever you are, you should always be contented, but especially at home, because there you must spend most of your time. I did not quite like at breakfast to hear you talk so much about the French bread at Northanger." "I'm sure I don't care about the bread. It's all the same to me what I eat. There's a very clever essay in one of the books upstairs upon so much There's a very clever essay in one of the books upstairs upon so much a subject, about young girls that have been spoilt for home by great acquaintance. The Mirror, I think. I'll look it out for you one day. I'll look it out for you one I'll look it out for you some day or other, because I'm sure it will do you good." Catherine said no more, and with an endeavor to do right, applied to her work. But after a few minutes, sunk again, without knowing it herself, into languor and listlessness. into languor and listlessness, moving herself in her chair from the irritation of weariness much oftener than she moved her needle. Mrs. Morland watched the progress of this relapse, and seeing in her daughter's absent and dissatisfied look the full proof of that repining spirit to which she had now begun to attribute her want of cheerfulness, hastily left the room to fetch the book in question, anxious to lose no time in attacking so dreadful a malady. It was some time before she could find what she looked for, and other family matters occurring to detain her, a quarter of an hour had elapsed ere she returned downstairs with the volume from which so much was hoped. Her avocations above having shut out all noise but what she had created herself, she knew not that a visitor had arrived within the last few minutes, till on entering the room, the first object she beheld was a young man whom she had never seen before. With a look of much respect, he immediately rose, and being introduced to her by her conscious daughter as Mr. Henry Tilney, with the embarrassment of real sensibility, began to apologize for his appearance there, acknowledging that after what had passed he had little right to expect a welcome at Fullerton, and stating his impatience to be assured of Miss Morland's having reached her home in safety as the cause of his intrusion. He did not he did not address himself to an uncandid judge or a resentful heart. Far from comprehending him or his sister in their father's misconduct, Mrs. Morland had been always kindly disposed towards each, and instantly, pleased by his appearance, received him with the simple professions of unaffected benevolence, thanking him for such an attention to her daughter, assuring him that the friends of her children were always welcome there, and entreating him to say not another word of the past. He was not ill inclined to obey this request, for though his heart was greatly relieved by such unlooked for mildness, it was not just at that moment in his power to say anything to the purpose. Returning in silence to his seat, therefore, he remained for some minutes, most civilly answering all Mrs. Morland's common remarks about the weather and roads. Catherine, meanwhile, the anxious, agitated, happy, feverish Catherine, said not a word, but her glowing cheek and brightened eye made her mother trust that this good-natured visit would at least set her heart at ease for a time, and gladly, therefore, did she lay aside the first volume of The Mirror for a future hour. Still got a little ways to go. Hope you're doing good. It's just chapter 30, Northanger Abbey. About, halfway done with the chapter. Desirous of Mr. Morland's assistance, as well as in giving encouragement, as in finding conversation for a guest, whose embarrassment on his father's account she earnestly pitied, Mrs. Morland had very early dispatched one of the children to summon him. But Mr. Morland was from home, and being thus without any support, at the end of a quarter of an hour she had nothing to say. After a couple of minutes' unbroken silence, Henry, turning to Catherine for the first time since her mother's entrance, asked her with sudden alacrity if Mr. and Mrs. Allen were now at Fullerton, and on developing from amidst all her perplexity of words in reply the meaning which one short syllable would have given, immediately expressed his intention of paying his respects to them, and with a rising color asked her if she would have the goodness to show him the way. "You may see the house from this window, sir," was the information on Sarah's side, which produced only a bow of acknowledgment from the gentleman and a silence and nod from her mother. For Mrs. Morland, thinking it probable, as a secondary consideration in his wish of waiting on their worthy neighbors, that he might have some explanation to give of his father's behavior, which it must be more pleasant for him to communicate only to Catherine, would not on any account prevent her accompanying him. They began their walk, and Mrs. Morland was not entirely mistaken in his object in wishing it. Some explanation on his father's account he had to give, but his first purpose was to explain himself, and before they reached Mr. Allen's grounds, he had done it so well that Catherine did not think it could ever be repeated too often. She was assured of his affection, and that heart in turn was solicited, which perhaps they pretty equally knew was already entirely his own. For though Henry was now sincerely attached to her, though he felt delighted in all the excellencies of her character and truly loved her society, I must confess that I must confess that his affection originated in nothing better than gratitude, or, in other words, that a persuasion of her partiality for him had been the only cause of giving her a serious thought. It's a new circumstance in romance, I acknowledge, and dreadfully derogatory of a heroine's dignity. But if it is but if it be as new in common life, the credit of a wild imagination will be at least all my own. A very short visit to Mrs. Allen, in which Henry talked at random, without sense or connection, and Catherine, wrapped in the contemplation of her own unutterable happiness, scarcely opened her lips, dismissed them to the ecstasies of another tete-a-tete, and before it was suffered to close, she was enabled to judge how far he was sanctioned by parental authority in his present application. On his return from Woodston 2 days before, he had been met near the Abbey by his impatient father, hastily informed in angry terms of Miss Morland's departure, in order to think of her no more. Such was the permission upon which he had now offered her his hand. The affrighted Catherine, amidst all the terrors of expectation, as she listened to this account, could not but rejoice in the kind caution with which Henry had saved her from the necessity of a conscientious rejection, by engaging her faith before he mentioned the subject, and as he mentioned to give her the particulars and explain the motives of his father's conduct, her feelings soon hardened into even a triumphant delight. The general had had nothing to accuse her of, nothing to lay to her charge, but her being the involuntary, unconscious object of a deception which his pride could not pardon, and which a better pride would have been ashamed to own. She was guilty only of being less rich than he had supposed her to be. Under a mistaken persuasion of her possessions and claims, he had courted her acquaintance in Bath, solicited her company at Northanger, and designed her for his daughter-in-law. On discovering his error, to turn her from the house seemed the best, though to his feelings an inadequate proof of his resentment towards her. Dang it. Sometimes you just don't pay to get out of bed. Though to his feelings an inadequate proof of his resentment towards herself and his contempt of her family. John Thorpe had first misled him. The general, perceiving his son one night at the theatre to be paying considerable attention to Miss Morland, had accidentally inquired of Thorpe if he knew more of her than her name. Thorpe, most happy to be on speaking terms with a man of General Tilney's importance, had been joyfully and proudly communicative, and being at that time not only in daily expectation of Morland's engaging Isabella, but likewise pretty well resolved upon marrying Catherine himself, his vanity induced him to represent the family as yet more wealthy than his vanity and avarice had made him believe them. With whomever he was, or was likely to be connected, his own consequence always required that theirs should be great, and as his intimacy with any acquaintance grew, so regularly grew their fortune. The expectations of his friend Morland, therefore, from the first overrated, had ever since his introduction to Isabella been gradually increasing, and by merely adding twice as much for the grandeur of the moment, by doubling what he chose to think the amount of Mr. Morland's preferment, trebling his private fortune, bestowing a rich aunt, and sinking half the children, he was able to represent the whole family to the general in a most respectable light. For Catherine, however, the peculiar object of the general's curiosity and his own speculations, he had yet something more in reserve, and the 10,000 or 15,000 pounds which her father could give her would be a pretty addition to Mr. Allen's estate. Her intimacy there had made him seriously determine on her being handsomely legacied hereafter, and to speak of her, therefore, as almost acknowledged future heiress of Fullerton naturally followed. Upon such intelligence, the general had proceeded, for it never occurred to him to doubt its authority. Thorpe's Thorpe's interest in the family, by his sister's approaching connection with one of its members, and his own views on another, circumstances of which he boasted with almost equal openness, seemed sufficient vouchers for his truth. And to these were added the absolute facts of the Allens being wealthy and childless, of Miss Moreland's being under their care, and, as soon as his acquaintance allowed him to judge, of their treating her with parental kindness. His resolution was soon formed. Already he had discerned a liking toward Miss Moreland in the countenance of his son, and thankful for Mr. Thorpe's communication, he almost instantly determined to spare no pains in weakening his boasted interest and ruining his dearest hopes. Catherine herself could not be more ignorant at the time of all this than his own children. Henry and Eleanor, perceiving nothing in their situation likely to engage their father's particular respect, had seen with astonishment the suddenness, continuance, and extent of his attention. And though latterly, from some hints which had accompanied an almost positive command to his son of doing everything in his power to attach her, Henry was convinced of his father's belief in it to be an advantageous connection. It was not till the late explanation at Northanger that they had the smallest idea of the false calculations which had hurried him on. That they were false, the general had learnt from the very person who had suggested them, from Thorpe himself, whom he had chanced to meet again in town, and who, under the influence of exactly opposite feelings, irritated by Catherine's refusal, and yet more by the failure of a very recent endeavour to accomplish a reconciliation between Moreland and Isabella, convinced that they were separated forever and spurning a friendship which could no longer be serviceable, hastened to contradict all that he had said before to the advantage of the Morelands. Confessed himself to have been totally mistaken in his opinion of their circumstances and character. What in the world? What is that? I don't even know this word. I've never seen this word. I'm going to look it up. Okay. A bragging Rhodomont. Okay, how do I say it? That's what I'm saying. Pronunciation. Rhodomont. Pronunciation. Rhodomontade. Do you know what a rhodomontade is? I do. It's a vain speech about yourself. Yeah. Rhodomontade. A braggy speech is what it means. Okay. Rhodomontade. Okay. You learn something every day. Where were we? Okay. Misled by the rhodomontade of his friend to believe his father a man of substance and credit, whereas the transactions of the 2 or 3 last weeks proved him to be neither. For after coming eagerly forward on the first overture of a marriage between the families with the most liberal proposals, he had, on being brought to the point by the shrewdness of the relator, been constrained to acknowledge himself incapable of giving the young people even a decent support. They were, in fact, a necessitous family, numerous, too, almost beyond example, by no means respected in their own neighborhood, as he had particularly opportunities of discovering, aiming at a style of life which their fortune could not warrant, seeking to better themselves by wealthy connections, a forward, bragging, scheming race. The terrified general pronounced the name of Allen with an inquiring look, and here, too, Thorpe had learned his error. The Allens, he believed, had lived near them too long, and he knew the young man on whom the Fullerton estate must devolve. The general needed no more. Enraged with almost everybody in the world but himself, he set out the next day for the Abbey, where his performances have been seen. I leave it to my reader's sagacity to determine how much of all this it's possible for Henry to communicate at this time to Catherine, how much of it he could have learnt from his father, in what points his own conjectures might assist him, and what portion must yet remain to be told in a letter from James. I have united for their case what they must divide for mine. Catherine, at any rate, heard enough to feel that in suspecting General Tilney of either murdering or shutting up his wife, she had scarcely sinned against his character or magnified his cruelty. Henry, in having such things to relate to his father, was almost as pitiable as their first avowal to himself. He blushed for the narrow-minded counsel which he was obliged to expose. The conversation between them at Northanger had been of the most unfriendly kind. Henry's indignation on hearing how Catherine had been treated, on comprehending his father's views, and being ordered to acquiesce in them, had been open and bold. The general, accustomed on every ordinary occasion to give the law in his family, prepared for no reluctance but of feeling. No opposing desire that should dare to clothe itself in words could brook the opposition of his son, steady as the sanction of reason and the dictate of conscience could make it. But in such a case, his anger, though it must shock, could not intimidate Henry, who was sustained in his purpose by a conviction of its justice. He felt himself bound as much in honor as in affection to Miss Morland, and believing that heart to be his own, which he had been directed to gain, no unworthy retraction of a tacit consent, no reversing decree of unjustifiable anger could shake his fidelity or influence the resolutions it prompted. He steadily refused to accompany his father into Herefordshire. An engagement formed almost at the moment to promote the dismissal of Catherine, and as steadily declared his intention of offering her his hand. The general was furious in his anger, and they departed in dreadful disagreement. Henry, in an agitation of mind which many solitary hours were required to compose, had returned almost instantly to Woodston, and on the afternoon of the following day had begun his journey to Fullerton. That was chapter 30. Now we enter the last chapter of Northanger Abbey. A little celebratory bite. Oh, it's so good. Amazing. Delicious. All right, last chapter. Chapter 31. Mr. and Mrs. Morland's surprise on being applied to by Mr. Tilney for their consent to his marrying their daughter was for a few minutes considerable, it having never entered their heads to suspect an attachment on either side. But as nothing, after all, could be more natural than Catherine's being beloved, they soon learnt to consider it with only the happy agitation of gratified pride, and as far as they alone were concerned, had not a single objection to start. His pleasing manners and good sense were self-evident recommendations, and having never heard evil of him, it was not their way to suppose any evil could be told. Goodwill supplying the place of experience, his character needed no attestation. Catherine would make a sad, heedless young housekeeper, to be sure, was her mother's foreboding remark, but quick was the consolation of there being nothing like practice. There was but one obstacle, in short, to be mentioned, but till that one was removed, it must be impossible for them to sanction the engagement. Their tempers were mild, but their principles were steady, and while his parents so expressly forbade the connection, they could not allow themselves to encourage it. That the general should come forward to solicit the alliance, or that he should even very heartily approve of it, they were not refined enough to make any parading stipulation. But the decent appearance of consent must be yielded, and that once obtained, and their own hearts made them trust that it could not be very long denied, their willing approbation was instantly to follow. His consent was all that they wished for. They were no more inclined than entitled to demand his money. Of a very considerable fortune his son was, by marriage settlements, eventually secure. His present income was an income of independence and comfort, and under every pecuniary change it was a match beyond the claims of their daughter. The young people could not be surprised at a decision like this. They felt and they deplored, but they could not resent it, and they parted, endeavoring to hope that such a change in the general, and each believed endeavoring to hope that such a change in the general, as each believed almost impossible, might speedily take place to unite them again in the fullness of privileged affection. Henry returned to what was now his only home to watch over his young plantations and extend his improvements for her sake, to whose share in them he overlooked to whose share in them he looked anxiously forward, and Catherine remained at Fullerton to cry. Whether the torments of absence were softened by a clandestine correspondence, let us not inquire. Mr. and Mrs. Morland never did. They had been too kind to exact any promise, and whenever Catherine received a letter, as at that time happened pretty often, they always looked the other way. The anxiety, which in this state of their attachment must be the portion of Henry and Catherine, and of all who loved either, as to its final event, can hardly extend, I fear, to the bosom of my readers, who will see in the telltale compression of the pages before them that we are all hastening together to perfect felicity. The means by which their early marriage was effected can be the only doubt. What probable circumstance could work upon a temper like the general's? The circumstance which chiefly availed was the marriage of his daughter to a man of fortune and consequence. Was the marriage of his daughter with a man of fortune and consequence, which took place in the course of the summer, an accession of dignity that threw him into a fit of good humor, from which he did not recover till after Eleanor had obtained his forgiveness of Henry and his permission for him to be a fool if he liked it. The marriage of Eleanor Tilney, her removal from all the evils of such a home as Northanger had been made by Henry's banishment to the home of her choice and the man of her choice, is an event which I expect to give general satisfaction among all her acquaintance. My own joy on the occasion is very sincere. I know no more entitled by unpretending merit or better prepared by habitual suffering to receive and enjoy felicity. Her partiality for this gentleman was not of recent origin, and he had been long withheld only by inferiority of situation from addressing her. His unexpected accession to title and fortune had removed all his difficulties, and never had the general loved his daughter so well in all her hours of companionship, utility, and patient endurance as when he first hailed her, "Your ladyship." Her husband was really deserving of her, independent of his peerage, his wealth, and his attachment being to a precision the most charming young man in the world. Any further definition of his merits must be unnecessary. The most charming young man in the world is instantly before the imagination of us all. Concerning the one in question, therefore, I have only to add, aware that the rules of composition forbid the introduction of a character not connected with my fable, that this was the very gentleman whose negligent servant left behind him that collection of washing bills resulting from a long visit at Northanger, by which my heroine was involved in one of her most alarming adventures. The influence of the Viscount and the Viscountess in their brother's behalf was assisted by that right understanding of Mr. Morland's circumstances, which, as soon as the general would allow himself to be informed, they were qualified to give. It taught him that he had been scarcely more misled by Thorpe's first boast of the family wealth than by his subsequent malicious overthrow of it, that in no sense of the word were they necessitous or poor, and that Catherine would have 3,000 pounds. This was so material an amendment of his late expectations that it greatly contributed to smooth the descent of his pride, and by no means without its effect was the private intelligence, which he was at some pains to procure, that the Fullerton estate, being entirely at the disposal of its present proprietor, was consequently open to every greedy speculation. On the strength of this, the general, soon after Eleanor's marriage, permitted his son to return to Northanger, and thence made him the bearer of his consent, very courteously worded in a page full of empty professions to Mr. Morland. The event which it authorized soon followed. Henry and Catherine were married. The bells rang and everybody smiled. And as this took place, within a 12-month from the first day of their meeting, it will not appear, after all the dreadful delays occasioned by the general's cruelty, that they were essentially hurt by it. To begin perfect happiness at the respective ages of 26 and 18 is to do pretty well, and professing myself moreover convinced that the general's unjust interference, so far from being really injurious to their felicity, was perhaps rather conducive to it, by improving their knowledge of each other and adding strength to their attachment, I leave it to be settled by whomsoever it may concern, whether the tendency of this work be altogether to recommend parental tyranny or reward filial disobedience. The end. There we go. There is the end of Northanger Abbey. So, thank you very much for watching, listening. Please subscribe if you haven't. Please like the video, and thank you for watching. Let me know what you want to hear next. And I'm going to take a break because next week I'll be out of town from book recording, even though I will do some lives, I think, hopefully. But then I will start back the week after next with my next book, and we'll see what that is. So anyway, have a good one. Thanks for watching. Talk to you later.